Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Austin Coppock, and we're going to be talking about the astrology of November 2024 in this episode. Hey, Austin, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, all right. So, in the first half of this episode, we're going to spend about an hour talking about news and events that have occurred since our last forecast a month ago and the astrological correlations that coincided with those news events. Then, in the second hour of this episode, we're going to jump into the forecast for November and do a deep dive into the astrology of the next 4 weeks. So, as always, there's going to be timestamps in the description below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website if you want to jump ahead to the forecast section. But otherwise, yeah, get ready for some news and events. So, before we jump into the news, I wanted to do just a quick overview to give you a preview of the astrology of November and what we're going to be talking about later in this episode. So here is the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the month. And then this is the planetary alignments calendar, which shows the major astrological dates and alignments over the course of the next 4 weeks. So at the top of the month, we start with a new moon in the sign of Scorpio on November 1st. Then on the 2nd, Mercury moves into the sign of Sagittarius. On the 3rd, we get a Venus-Jupiter opposition that goes exact the same day that there's a Mars-Pluto opposition that goes exact. And then later on that same day, Mars actually moves into the sign of Leo, where it's going to stay for the next couple of months because it's going to go retrograde in that sign starting in December. The following week of November, we get Venus moving from Sagittarius into Capricorn on the 11th of the month. Then we get our second lunation of the month on the 15th, which is a full moon in the sign of Taurus, which occurs the same day that Saturn stations direct in the sign of Pisces. The following day, the sun opposes Uranus in Taurus. Then on the 19th of November, Pluto departs from a decade-long trip through Capricorn and moves into Aquarius for the next 20 years. 2 days after that, Sagittarius season begins with the sun moving into Sagittarius on the 21st. And then finally, Mercury stations retrograde in Sagittarius on the 25th and begins a 3-week retrograde period. So those are some of the major highlights of the month. Here's the planetary transits calendar that Madeline DeCoates of honeycomb.co made for us in order to visualize some of the major aspects happening this month, such as the Mars-Pluto opposition, the Venus-Jupiter opposition, and other aspects. Here is the Mars retrograde graphic that Madeline also made, which helps us to visualize some of the major stuff happening this month, primarily the ingress of Mars going into Leo on the 3rd and Mars opposing Pluto the exact same day before it makes that ingress. And then finally, the last graphic is our Mercury retrograde graphic that Madeline came up with this month from honeycomb.co, showing Mercury entering its pre-retrograde shadow period already on November 7th, immediately after Election Day, before building up to the actual retrograde period, which begins on November 25th and doesn't end until December 15th. All right, so those are some of the major alignments that we're going to talk about this month. Why don't we jump right into news and events that have happened over the past few weeks and talk about some of those astrological correlations? There's been a ton of stuff because, of course, early last month, in the first half of the month, we had the second leg of eclipse season where we had an eclipse that occurred in Pisces in the previous month and at the end of September. And then there was an eclipse that occurred in the sign of Libra at the very beginning of October. And there were many different news stories that really focused on that eclipse around that time. So the first news story, of course, was there were some major events that happened between Israel, Lebanon, and Iran. And we had anticipated that this eclipse season, especially the Libra eclipse, would be the next phase or the next installment of the continuing saga between especially those countries in the Middle East. And indeed, right on pretty much on the eclipse within 24 hours, on October 1st, Israel invaded Lebanon and began a ground war. And this occurred right before the eclipse occurred in Libra on October 2nd. So this had been preceded exactly 2 weeks earlier on the previous eclipse, which occurred on September 17th, by the pager attack, which occurred when hundreds or thousands of pagers were exploded in Lebanon, which then acted as a precursor. So again, we've seen events lining up extremely closely in terms of different things that's happening there, especially in terms of Israel and some of the different steps that have been taken in different turning points. Also, the same day on October 1st, Iran launched missiles at Israel, reportedly in retaliation for some assassinations that had occurred over the previous few months. So it ended up being like a major day when a bunch of stuff was happening, all centered right on that Libra eclipse. So that made a lot of, I mean, sense in terms of us having expected a continuation and an important turning point, and then really seeing some major developments happening, I think, right?
Yeah, well, we saw the we saw this set of situations emerge last October when we had a Libra solar eclipse, and that's when this round of hostilities got going, and then we saw things. We saw, for lack of better language, the next episode or installment 6 months later during that set of eclipses, and shortly after the attacks and retaliations last year, we'd both looked into the history, and we'd found that every time there were eclipses, especially the South Node, every time there were eclipses in Libra and Aries, especially with the North Node in Aries and the South Node in Libra, there was another round of deadly hostilities between Israel and neighbors. And so based on the history, we'd expect at every round of these eclipses, beginning with the ones this spring and then continuing with the eclipse, the set of eclipses we just experienced over the last month, to bring more of this and to tell that terrible story.
Yeah, for sure, especially with the birth chart of Israel having Libra rising, and with the current leader of Israel, Netanyahu, having a Libra stellium and being born on the day of a Libra eclipse. So, and earlier this year, we had noted that on one of these two eclipses, I think was it the Aries eclipse that ended up being the first time that Iran directly launched missiles at Israel. So this second set of eclipses, where again there was this open launching of missiles between the two countries, ended up being a striking connection astrologically between those dates 6 months ago, earlier this year, that coincided with eclipses, and then the ones this month that also coincided with eclipses.
Yeah, yeah. There's been too much stuff to go over here right now. The solar eclipse the solar eclipse in April also set the stage for the sudden disappearance of several members of top level Iranian leadership in the helicopter crash. Which has not been linked directly to the hostilities, but still plays into the story regardless.
Yeah, for sure. And so speaking of that, then this month on the full moon, very close to the full moon, there was like a really difficult full moon in Aries that we talked about in the middle of October. Israel killed the leader of Hamas at that time, and he was said to have been the architect of the October 7th attacks. And it was striking because this was the first full moon that was not an eclipse in the sign of Aries in over a year now. And it wasn't just that full moon, but also there was the appearance of a comet at that time. And I had talked about this a comet in the year ahead forecast because in ancient astrology, a lot of the texts that talk about comets are very foreboding because they talk about like world leaders dying and important people dying and things like that. And I thought there was a striking coincidence between the greatest visibility of this comet and then the leader of Hamas being killed or being assassinated at that time, in terms of just like world events and prominent people and some of those ancient astrological principles or concepts still being relevant today.
Yeah, for sure. And we also sort of muddying the waters or just sort of densifying the omens. We also had a comet during eclipse season in the spring as well.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Um, all right. So other things that happen in terms of that the 25th of this month of October, just a few days ago, Israel struck back at Iran, and there just keeps being this tit for tat that keeps going back and forth and seems to be like escalating every time we go into one of these new periods. So the next set of eclipses is going to occur in about 6 months in March and early April. And we'd expect another major turning point and continuation of some of these events at that point. And actually, it continues to escalate so much, especially when Aries keeps getting activated, not just the Libra sign, but also Aries, that there's a ton of stuff happening in Aries next month, which is actually starting to make me very nervous because it seems to heighten the possibility of further escalation where we're going to have Venus going retrograde in Aries next spring, early next year. We're going to have Saturn and Neptune moving into Aries. We're going to have one last Aries eclipse take place around that time. And it seems like, especially Israel keeps responding to Libra transits, and Iran keeps responding sometimes to Aries transits. So that's one of the things we'll be paying attention to early next year.
Yeah, well, one of the charts that's used for modern Iran um, has the sun in Aries and a Leo rising. And so all of the Aries stuff would be on Iran's Aries sun, which is also the ruler of the rising, which is that things in Aries keep triggering events for Iran suggests that that chart's pretty useful. And then I guess to add to concerns about uh, mm, yeah March April next year, the Aries ingress chart, which is which is a tool used for mundane calculation, like what will happen to this nation for Iran next year, has Mars conjunct the degree of the rising, which is a very strong indicator of not peace. For there, I couldn't find too many precedents because modern Iran, like post-revolution Iran, it's literally about, I think it's 3 weeks older, or excuse me, 3 weeks younger than I am. It's 79. It's spring of 79. But the year that Iraq invaded Iran, Mars was also on the rising. That time in Leo, the rising of the Aries ingress chart, and so yeah, there are a number of eyebrow. There are two eyebrows, and they're mine, and they're permanently raised about that region, especially Iran, coming into next spring.
Yeah, for sure. So we'll be paying attention to that. Um, all right. So moving on to other major news stories that happened. I mentioned this already, but a comet became visible in the middle of the sky over the course of the middle of the month, especially. And I found some pictures on Wikipedia that different people took of the comet around the world, and it actually became visible to the naked eye. Some of these were taken with like advanced photography, especially like time lapses and stuff. But there's a number of people, especially outside of like major cities, that it could actually look up and see the comet, which was just to the right of Venus, which is a very bright star at this point because it has some distance from the sun. Um, yeah. So did you get, I didn't get to see it. I was like in the middle of downtown Denver. I looked for it a couple of nights. It was cloudy, too many nights. And the two that I did look for it, I didn't see it. And I wish I realized in retrospect, I wished I had like gone outside of town and gone to the mountains or something, and I probably could have seen it. Did you see it?
No, our visibility is terrible in the West. We've got earth and rocks and trees obstructing the view.
Hmm. Yeah. That is a bummer. Well, if anybody did see it, let us know in the comments like what it looked like or what your sort of feeling was that was invoked by it. It's interesting that we've had so many different visual phenomenon this year that have been visible to the naked eye, like that major eclipse that went across the US in April. We've had like auroras and stuff taking place twice this year. And now we've had two comets, although this one was much more visible than the one that happened earlier this year, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been a great year for most people, so I'm sure that all that old comet lore and all the stuff about dire portents in the sky is wrong.
Yeah, well,
Those,
yeah.
those are just like that's like the confetti celebrating things all working out for the best for everybody.
Yeah, I don't know if your sarcasm is going to translate perfectly, but I think I detect some slight sarcasm because yeah, it's been a crazy year. It's been a very notable year, and also there's been some pretty terrible stuff that's happened. And I pulled out the a quote from Manilius and a quote from Shakespeare in our 2024 year ahead forecast when I was talking about some of these visible things like comets. I'm just going to pull those out again for a reminder. Uh, so this was Manilius on comets. He says, such are the disasters which the glowing comets often proclaim. Death comes with those celestial torches which threaten earth with the blaze of pyres unceasing, since heaven and nature's self are stricken and seem doomed to share men's tomb. Wars, too, the fires portend, and sudden insurrection, and arms uplifted in stealthy treachery. Comets also presage civil discord and strife between kin. And then, of course, Shakespeare has that famous line in the tragedy of Julius Caesar where he says, when beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes. So that's obviously a little over the top, but it's like, we've seen some pretty crazy and intense stuff this year. And one of the questions we have also is just with this comet having just taken place this month, what that might be indicating that doesn't just coincide precisely with the date of the event in the middle of October, but also if that's like an omen of some of the stuff that we're seeing starting to unfold over the next few months. So the fact that it's like taking place right before the US election, for example, did not escape me, and I'll be paying attention to what happens in terms of that.
Certainly. Well, and the seemingly over the top Shakespeare quote that comets portend the death of princes. We've had two this year, and there were high level leadership deaths during those periods, both times. And then in between, right, we had a very close call assassination with a former US president, which hasn't happened since what, like was Reagan shot at in 1980, early 80s? It's been quite some time. So,
Yeah, and
and
then we had another president who stepped down and like dropped out of a race unexpectedly, which
right,
also
right,
hasn't
right.
hasn't happened since the 1960s.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. Right. Like, and not a physical death, but a disappearance or removal or absence as in yeah. Um Worth sort of to add to that, I just wanted to point out that we talked a lot about Mars and Aries and all of the conflicts and the Mars-Pluto opposition, which is still growing up until early November. It's quite tight right now, but it was activated by the full moon. And I just wanted to briefly address that in addition to there being escalation in violence between Israel and Lebanon, almost all of our other ongoing conflicts also ramped up a little bit. The United States used stealth bombers for the first time on Houthi positions, which was there's been some back and forth there, but that was an escalation. It was a busy month of warfare in Ukraine, and we now have North Korean troops showing up to fight for Russia in that conflict, which is another escalation. The Sudanese civil war has intensified. It's actually just yesterday that the UN Secretary General described it as a nightmare of violence, hunger, disease, and displacement. And although not full scale war. The Haitian crisis has intensified um, significantly over the last month, and also described recently by the UN as a spiraling crisis of rampant violence and food insecurity. And so all of that, negative Nelly talk that we did on the podcast last month is reflected very clearly in what has actually happened.
Yeah. Yeah, the Mars retrograde especially is clearly getting more and more intense, and we're just sort of getting started in terms of some of that. So that's been our balance that we try to find over the past several years, ever since the pandemic, really, which is like, when you see difficult stuff coming up, to what extent do you call it like you see it versus to what extent do you try to counterbalance things and also point out some of the good things? We're going to run into that as an issue this month where we've got some favorable configurations like the Venus Jupiter opposition, but it coincides right at the same time with one of the most unfavorable configurations, which is a Mars Pluto opposition that goes exact the same day. So we'll have to once again try to navigate that in terms of calling it like we see it when it comes to this forecast for next month.
I think this month will make it a little bit easier for us. I think there's more balance in this month to describe. I don't think
Hmm.
October was terribly well balanced.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. We'll come back. We'll circle around to that. We'll have that discussion here in a little bit. So
Yeah, absolutely.
let me finish off the news. So, on October 9th, Hurricane Milton made landfall, and we had the second major hurricane that hit the US during this hurricane season. I thought it was notable that this one was right around the time of the Libra eclipse, within a week of it. And with it being a Libra eclipse and an air sign, one of the headlines I saw was that it created at least 41 tornadoes, which caused deaths in Florida when that hurricane made landfall. So additionally, large parts of the U.S. are still recovering from the previous hurricane, which coincided with the Pisces eclipse, or happened not long after the Pisces eclipse in September. And I was seeing headlines about this that were water related, which I thought was really striking because we continue to see water themes come up from Saturn and Pisces that actually got accentuated by the first eclipse in the sign of Pisces as well. So one of the headlines on October 16th recently said, the Washington Post said, how Asheville residents survive without running water weeks after Helene. It said it's likely to still be weeks or months before taps in this part of Appalachia become flowing again with clean, potable water. And then I saw another news story that said that there was a major business or a factory that was hit by the first hurricane by Helene, which created IV fluid bags for hospitals around the United States, and that factory was completely knocked out. And as a result of that, hospitals across the country were bracing for shortages when it came to IV fluids and fluid drips. And I thought that was again such a very literal manifestation of Saturn and Pisces and a lack of fluids, like literally.
Yeah, and well, it's interesting that we have that water-based symbolism and also reality coming from Helene, which was right after the eclipse in Pisces, a water sign, and then we had an unprecedented number of tornado warnings and tornado touchdowns after for Milton, which was the eclipse in an air sign. Also, with Milton, there was a lot less rainfall than was expected. And so the majority of the damage was actually done by air. It was done
Mm,
by the wind. There was less water damage than expected. My folks are actually about 10, 15 miles away from where it touched down. So and
yeah.
they're fine, but we were watching that pretty carefully. But yeah, there was more wind damage than expected for the air sign one, and lots of water-based consequences for the water sign one. And it's worth noting that even though the hurricane made landfall on October 9th, it started brewing up and being visible as a hurricane system and raising eyebrows very shortly after the eclipse.
Mm, okay. Yeah. Yeah. It was really striking just watching it happen live and seeing the unfolding of some of these things in concert with those alignments.
Yeah.
So other eclipse stuff that happened. the vice presidential debate happened on October 1st, and this was within 24 hours of the Libra eclipse. And it was weird because it started with Gemini rising, and Mercury was in Libra along with the sun and the moon at that point. So there was a stellium in Libra. And a lot of the comments on what happened with the debate referred to how surprising, like weirdly agreeable both candidates were being throughout the entire debate. So some of the keywords I wrote down were cordiality, I agree, surprisingly affable, and trying to be affable were like some of the comments people were making afterwards. And also wrote down two Washington Post headlines. The first one said, Walsh, Vance tout opposing views on key issues in composed debate. And then a later headline there said, in civil debate, Vance and Walsh focus more on policy than personal jabs. And there was even one famous political commentator streamer on Twitter who wrote in all caps, "Stop agreeing." And that was his like immediate reaction to the debate because both of them kept agreeing with each other and finding points of agreement, um, almost like too much at times when there was points that they actually really disagreed about. But it was so striking seeing that Libra stellium and see that be like the outcome and see that being what people were talking about.
Yeah, I actually watched most of that one, and it was like a Twilight Zone episode with a US political focus,
Right.
where it's like that it was completely out of sync with the tone of the election and any messaging or speech around the election path, before, after, or outside of that tiny bubble. It was very bizarre world.
Or even with their own messaging, because both of them had been attacking each other very strongly for the month or two leading up to that. And then both of them immediately went back to attacking each other within a few days of the debate. But it was weird also because it was kind of like a time machine as well, taking you back like 20 years or 10 or 15 at least before the current era and just reminding you what debates in the country like used to look like more or less.
Yeah, there was a certain nostalgia to it. Like, what if people always mostly talked about issues? That would be like, do I have memories of that happening, or am I just being too fond of the past? Am I imagining a golden age that never was?
Right. Or a period of either civility or a period of at least like the premise of civility, even if they're actually still saying terrible things about each other, doing weird political scheming, which I guess in reality was probably always happening and really was, I guess, if you think about it.
Sure. Yeah. But yeah, it was notable. It was a notable, like strange, and that's sometimes, the eclipses sometimes do, they do a variety of dramatic things, but sometimes sometimes the drama is that something is very odd, right? Like the that debate had the quality of the eye of a hurricane, where 5 minutes previous it sounded like there were, 100 trains driving through your yard, right, and everything's roaring, and then it's quieter than a normal day for a little bit, right? Like
Right.
very odd.
But if you look out on the periphery, there's like a train that's floating in the air that's like about to smash into your house if you just wait like 5 more minutes.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So that was that. Other things that happened in the news. Jupiter stationed in Gemini on October 9th, and Pluto stationed around the same time in Capricorn for the last time on October 11th. I wrote down that on October 10th, within 24 hours of the Jupiter station and the Pluto station, one, Tesla began selling humanoid robots for 20 to $30,000. And additionally, Elon Musk like announced Tesla's new Cybercab robo-taxi, which is a fully self-driving vehicle with no steering wheel or pedals that's designed to supposedly transform urban transport by providing uh, on-demand rides essentially. So there was some major developments taking place potentially in terms of Gemini related things, which is like travel, especially having to do with cars, especially I was thinking of that in as a preface to next year when we're going to get our first dip of Uranus going into Gemini, which we have been anticipating is going to really revolutionize and shake up the travel industry, especially with respect to cars and short distance travel. So that was notable. And then also there was another event that you mentioned, right, with respect to all of that.
Um,
Just
with
the rocket one.
oh yeah, on the 13th, SpaceX managed to retrieve a huge rocket after launch, which was the first successful, excuse me, the first successful demonstration of a concept that had been talked about for a while, which, if it can be replicated, brings down the cost of launching things and people into space um, tremendously and opens up a lot of new options for humans in space. So it was a big thing that they were able to successfully do that. Has a lot of implications for the future of space travel or into space travel.
Right. Yeah. So I thought those are notable because it was just like two travel things that were happening around the same time in the same time frame. Um, so yeah, we'll see where that goes in the future. Um, next major headline on October 11th through there was one headline on October 11th, but it related to the BRICS summit where officials started like meeting for a major international meeting in Russia. um, and there was like a pre-meeting around October 11th, which was very close to the Pluto station on the 13th. And then the actual summit happened about a week later, October 22nd through the 24th, where there was a 3-day summit in Russia that was attended by leaders or representatives from 36 different countries. And the Kremlin said that it was the largest foreign policy event ever held by Russia, and that I have a quote from one news source, it might have been the Washington Post, that said that the summit covered the deepening of financial cooperation, including the development of alternatives to Western dominated pay systems, efforts to settle regional conflicts, and an expansion of the BRICS group of nations. So we've been talking about this for the past several months, but I've been tying that into Pluto and Capricorn because those discussions about doing that and those countries trying to push the world off of the dollar and onto a new reserve currency has been ongoing since 2009, which was right when Pluto entered Capricorn. So I was super interested at the fact that there was this summit that was taking place around the time of the final station of Pluto in
Mhm.
Capricorn and the questions of whether that would have long-term implications. And like a lot of the media that I was reading was downplaying it and saying that it wasn't a big deal and that it wasn't super successful, but I'm having trouble reconciling that with seeing that Pluto station there and thinking that there actually might be more long-term implications than it might seem at first.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. We should come back to that. We should remember that this meeting took place in the Pluto station and see whether, from the vantage point of the future, it looks significant. I mean,
Yeah.
I think part of the significance is just that it's what you pointed out and found is just that this effort, like this BRICS project, is very tied to Pluto and Capricorn, right?
Mm.
Began right after Pluto decisively entered Capricorn. And so, it may be that the station is merely activating the thing that is tied to it with timing, because the planets also time things that fail or kind of succeed and kind of fail, right? Like they just because the planet's tied to it doesn't mean that it succeeds in its aims. It just means that it moves at that time scale.
Yeah. So we'll have to see, but I wanted to note it here for posterity for the future that I was paying attention to this at the time and how that coincided with Pluto stationing for the very last time in Capricorn. Moving on to other news, you had a story that you were tracking with the dock workers strike, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We had a new crib that we were hoping was going to get delivered, and then we saw that Kay was like, "Oh, there's a dock workers strike," and it was already delayed. It's going to be another month. And then we checked in on it, and the dock workers strike was gone. And so I looked into it, and so there's a massive port strike that began on October 1st and then was postponed on October 3rd. And it was postponed. It was not resolved. And the agreement was to let the current contracts run out on January 15th and then resume. And so it's interesting because it's relocating the strike from Mars direct in Cancer to Mars retrograde in Cancer. It's kind of same fight, but Mars retrograde, or moving from Mars moving forward through those degrees to Mars moving backwards. And so that's interesting. I don't know if that was a good re-election. I don't know. October was pretty rough skies. I don't know if that was a good time to talk it out, but the postponed date doesn't look particularly favorable either. It was also interesting to me because it was another weird note of peace, if not a lasting peace, that was struck during the solar eclipse in Libra, right? Because it's announced the first, solar eclipse in Libra on the second, postponed on the third. And so while the solar eclipse in large part did not bring peace to the world, right? Israel invaded Lebanon within a day of that. That was not a strange pocket of peace. That was not an eye of the storm. But we do have these two examples where there was like a strange lull fell over things with the Democratic debate as well, or not Democratic. I guess we're a democratic country, or we're trying to be. So the vice presidential debate, which takes place in a attempted something attempting to be a democracy, which was strangely peaceful. And then you had this, big strike. I believe it was 46,000 dock workers about to go on strike, which almost everybody would have felt with their deliveries. And it just sort of vanished. They're like, oh, we're not fighting, but we're going to fight
Well,
later.
Biden went down and negotiated that, and I think probably asked them to postpone it until after the election, and then they did. So whatever was involved in that, or whatever the rationale was that was presented, seemed effective. But that's really
Certainly.
notable that you pointed out that Mars will come back and retrograde back to where it was when they revisit it. So that's a great part of your point, is that's a great demonstration of the idea of shadow periods and how that actually works.
Right. That, like, look, we've been saying, look at what Mars is doing after it crosses the shadow degrees, just what, like 17 Cancer up to about 6 Leo is the shadow, because Mars is going to come back two times to those very same degrees. And so what might seem resolved may in fact need more layers of attention and effort and struggle.
Yeah, totally. So it's like, so we're looking at the diagram here, and here's early October, and Mars enters its shadow right there in early October,
Yep.
literally the day that the strike is postponed, the negotiation happens, and then it's supposed to come back, you said, in January.
I believe it's January 15th. That's when the current contracts expire and things need to be renegotiated for the next set of contracts.
So that's like somewhere in here in this range. And of Mars, of course, will return to Cancer January 6th.
Yeah, and the with that postponement taking place just as Mars entered the shadow, it means that Mars will be back at that same place for its direct station, and will sit there. And that direct station being in what, end of February.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I tell people in the pre-retrograde shadow period to be careful about what kind of conflicts you open up, because
Hmm.
you may think it is something that comes and passes, but then it could actually come back as like a boomerang and like revisit something you have to revisit in the future.
Indeed.
Yeah. All right. Other news, October 14th, there was a Washington Post headline that said NASA's Europa Clipper launched on a mission to icy Jupiter moon. And they think that Europa probably has a deep ocean and may have the conditions to sustain life. And I thought this was amazing because it was launched on October 14th at 12:06 p.m. in Cape Canaveral, Florida. 21 Sagittarius was rising, which meant that Jupiter was like right on the descendant when they launched this probe. to one of Jupiter's moons, and the moon was applying to a conjunction with Saturn and Pisces within about a degree. I just thought that was a hilarious continuation of the ocean themes that we keep seeing and the water themes we keep seeing with Saturn and Pisces, but this time humans sending a probe to see if there's like life on this ocean moon of Jupiter.
Yeah, the surface of which is completely covered with thick ice, right? The
Nice.
the the coldness of Saturn and then the water of Pisces. Yeah, there's a not terribly good sci-fi horror movie about a manned mission to Europa with like some sort of shadowy creature like hunting the astronauts from beneath the ice.
Nice. What's the name of that?
I don't remember. It was literally not. I haven't thought about it since I watched it like 7 years ago, except for right now. It was
It was
fine.
it was that good?
No, it wasn't that good.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I meant.
I'm sure you could just Google like Europa sci-fi horror.
I was just calculating the chart for this just because I wanted to show it because I was so impressed by that that moon Saturn conjunction. Look at it. Moon's at 12, 17 Pisces and Saturn's at 13, 32 Pisces. They're just forming a nice little conjunction right there as the probe is taking off for that icy ocean moon.
Yeah. Oh, it's called the Europa your report.
Okay,
I
cool.
will be really excited if the probe comes back with like images of giant monsters beneath the surface of Europa. That would be the best news.
Well, that was actually one of the things I noticed is that was the day that the Venus Uranus opposition was going act exact. So Venus is at 2612 Scorpio when it launched, and Uranus was at 2631 Taurus. And it would just be funny because we highlighted that as one of our potential like October surprise dates, and it would be funny if that was like a long-term October surprise where it's like surprise, there's organic life on another, body in our solar system.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. All right. So let's see, moving on. I don't know if we covered this because I think it was just happening as we were recording the last episode, but there was like a major, during eclipse season, there was a major downfall of a prominent figure. In this instance, Mayor Eric Adams became the first sitting mayor of New York City to be indicted on federal charges on September 26th. And this was right in the middle of those two eclipses that was taking place late last month and early this month. So there's not a lot to say about that, just that it was another example of that we keep seeing over and over of like prominent people falling or this pivot point where sometimes there's people falling and other times there's people dramatically rising into visibility around the time of eclipses.
Yeah, it's the whole eclipses, dragons, Game of Thrones. Like when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or die, or you win or are publicly humiliated.
Right. Yeah. So speaking of that, there's a continuation of one eclipse story from last year that was just kind of bizarre, even though it's not huge world news, but I wanted to note it. A doctor was charged and pled guilty on October 2nd in the Matthew Perry case, where he basically the doctor who prescribed or gave Matthew Perry ketamine was pled guilty. He was charged and pled guilty. And we remember from like late last year, Matthew Perry was an actor who died the day of an eclipse when he evidently like took ketamine or other things and then drowned in his hot tub. And it was kind of like a shocking death at the time that occurred exactly the day of an eclipse. And then weirdly, the eclipse theme continues even afterwards with the doctor who prescribed that to him pleading guilty literally the day of the eclipse on October 2nd.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's also interesting that it was an eclipse on the south node or K2, because I very strong I strongly associate and have seen the use of really intense dissociatives like ketamine, indicated by the position of natal K2 slash the south node or from a transit. Um, yeah, those things which give one distance or separate them separate them from themselves and their ego and their body.
Okay.
Just another instance of that. K2 mean.
Sure. Yeah. So, and then last major news story I noted was just, especially when Jupiter slowed down and stationed in Gemini in the middle of the month, on October 9th. All of a sudden, like the presidential race became the battle of the podcasts. And both candidates started doing a bunch of long form podcasts at that point. Harris did a ton, like within a few days of that station, going on like Howard Stern and Call Her Daddy and like a bunch of other huge podcasts like that. And then Trump also started going on a bunch of huge podcasts, eventually culminating with going on the Joe Rogan podcast in the past few days. But I thought it was really striking how this presidential election with Jupiter and Gemini has like turned into the battle of the podcasts and of, in that way, like non-traditional media taking more of a role in influencing the outcome of the election potentially than in any race prior to this point. There's something incredibly striking about that that's worth thinking about just with Jupiter and Gemini this year, and continues to be a major thing all the way up until the last minute, because now that Trump just went on Joe Rogan, now there's a lot of discussion over the past few days and like high drama about whether Harris will go on the Rogan podcast, and they keep going back and forth negotiating whether it will or won't happen. So it'll be curious to see how that goes in the next few days.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Sign of the times.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So that's pretty much it. So that brings us to the last piece of news, which is just that Election Day takes place on November 5th. Everybody should vote because it's going to be an extremely close election. And in some areas, only a handful of people are going to decide the course of history, especially in swing states where, for example, in 2016, some of the swing states were just incredibly close, where it came down to just thousands of votes, in terms of deciding the outcome of the election. So if you'd like to look up more information about voting and your registration, other things like that, there's a couple websites that I've seen passed around. One of them is vote.org, and the other one is iwillvote.com. So I'll put links to those in the description below this video on YouTube and on the podcast website. And yeah, just encourage everyone to vote in this really important election.
I think you said it well.
All right. All right. Well, I think that's it then for the news section. So, why don't we take a little break and then we'll transition to doing the forecast for November. All right, so before we start with the forecast, I wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor this month, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is taking place in person and online near Seattle this year, May 22nd through the 26th, 2025. This is going to be the 41st annual Northwest Astrological Conference. So here's a little graphic showing you some of the speakers at this great conference that's taking place next year. So registration is already open for NORWAC on October 1st. And the earlier you get the tickets, the cheaper it is, because they have different cutoff points during the course of the year between now and May, where the ticket price keeps going up. So this year they have more emphasis on the virtual component, where they're going to have a special virtual guest lecture by Richard Tarnas, who's giving a 2.5 hour workshop. There's going to be daily virtual Q&As with NORWAC speakers, as well as an in-person live stream hosted by our friend Nicholas Polomenakis. And I'm really excited about this online component because I actually attended online last year and I probably will again this year, just because they make it so that people that can't attend in person can really get the NORWAC experience and still be kind of like part of the conference in a really fun way. And I'm glad that they're continuing to expand those efforts. Um, for people that can attend, there's going to be a lot of other great lectures and workshops. Lisa Scheim's actually giving a pre-conference workshop on zodiac releasing, I believe, which is going to be an amazing workshop. And then there's a bunch of other speakers this year who have been people that have appeared on the podcast before, including Demetra George, Patrick Watson, Gemini Brett, Adam Ellenboss, Nina Griffin, Laura Nalbandian, Kira Sutherland, Ann Orteely, Ali Alomi, Christopher Renstrom, Sam Reynolds, Bear River, Wendy Stacy, Jen Zart, and many more. So you can check out the full speaker list, including reading through the different lecture descriptions at their website, which is norwac.net. And I'll post a link to the website in the description below this video or on the podcast website. So it's going to be a really excellent conference this year. It will sell out though. So if you have any intention of attending in person, just know that you should probably get tickets sooner rather than later, just because the past several years it's been so popular because it's one of the only conferences, only big conferences that's still taking place in the US. That it will probably sell out before too long. So make sure you secure your tickets if you plan on attending in person. And for the online attendees, you can sign up at any time, although the price will continue to go up between now and then. So it's best to sign up sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it'd be something ideally you'd get done before Christmas. Even though May sounds like a long end of May sounds like a long time from January. The hotel gets booked up, the tickets sell out. Like, your future self would appreciate it if you got it taken care of sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I was actually really annoyed because I signed up at the last minute for the online last year, and it was actually really pricey when I knew if I just signed up a few months earlier, it would have been much cheaper. So this is that time frame that we're in right now before the end of the year. Somebody was asking me, Austin, about like eating around there and what's in walking distance and whether you should get like the meal ticket versus whether people go out. And I was trying to remember, and the one place I know everybody goes to is like there's a really good Thai restaurant that's
Yep.
within walking distance. That's
That
what
that
you
was
thought
the
of,
first place my mind went.
right?
Yeah, whose name I can't remember, but I've eaten there every year. I've done a conference, so I don't know, 8, 9 times. And that's not walking distance. That's like around the corner, right? Like that's like 634 feet away from the hotel. Um,
Yeah. I guess the advice, because it depends on what you can afford, but like sometimes buying the meal ticket for the banquets is also a good idea because that's where people, like most people go there and then, get seated around the big tables and then there's like social interaction and stuff with that. And sometimes if it's your first conference, that can be a good way to like meet new people as well. And also it's like nice to have the option to do that. And then you have the option if you want to go out with people, you can and just give away your ticket versus if you don't buy it ahead of time and you go there and you suddenly like want to sit at the banquet table with people, you can't if you don't have a ticket ahead of time.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I try to give myself the option to banquet, unless, and then I stay open to to being seduced into a better situation, right? It has
Yeah,
to be better than the banquet to not eat at the banquet. And someone pointed out in the comments that the hotel restaurant isn't bad. The hotel restaurant got way better at some point in the last couple years because I remember eating there this year and thinking like this is so much better than any memory I have of this. And I have a lot of memories. So kudos to whoever like redesigned the menu and got the kitchen in order.
for sure. For sure. Aaron in the live chat says there's a few good restaurants over by the half price books there. So that's good to know. All right. Yeah. So find out more information at norwac.net. And yeah, otherwise we'll hear how the conference goes next year. Cool. All right, let's transition into talking about the forecast for next month, for the month of November. Maybe I should put up the planetary alignments again, just as a little glance at what we're looking at here, little quick overview. Um, so, right away, the two big things are there's several big things, but the big thing is that there's the Mars-Pluto opposition at the beginning of the month on like the 3rd, and then there's the Mercury retrograde at the end of the month, starting on the 25th. Although it's tricky because the Mercury retrograde shadow already starts like earlier on the 7th. So those are some of the primary things to talk about. Why don't we start with the lunation, though, the very first lunation, which was the Scorpio lunation, because I feel like that first lunation really bakes in the two main oppositions this month right away to the start of the month, especially for that 2 week period that that lunation is active from basically like the 1st of November into the rest of the month. So I'm going to pull up a chart here for those watching the video version where you can see the new moon that takes place on November 1st, right at 9 degrees of Scorpio. And right away, we can see the two primary oppositions that are fully formed at that point, basically. One of them is the much more positive and like optimistic and hopeful looking Venus Jupiter opposition, where already on the first, Venus is at 17 degrees of Sagittarius and it's applying to an opposition with Jupiter at 20 degrees of Gemini. That's really one of our more positive aspects this month is that opposition, but it's forming at the same time as this much more challenging and difficult and kind of like anger, conflict, fear oriented opposition between Mars and Pluto, where Mars is at 29 Cancer already on the first, and it's applying to an opposition with Pluto at 29 degrees of Capricorn. And both of these two oppositions culminate on November 3rd, just 2 days after this lunation. So that's going to be our initial signature for this month.
Yeah, and such a study in contrast. And whether you're getting the double benefic Venus Jupiter um results or the like fear, anger, and shadows Mars Pluto, very much a function of like how your chart is aligned, right? Like this is basically very nice for mutable planets, especially mutable planets later in the sign, and very rough for planets that are late cardinal. Um, and so they're, both of these are being handed out, but not equally. And the two axes of opposition don't really aspect each other. They're not really connected. Like the double good and the double bad are doing separate things, right? They're not able to, like, the bad is not able to corrupt or destroy the good, and the pleasant and the good is not able to ameliorate, remedy, or interfere with the bad. And so we've just got both of those happening.
Right. Like it's just happening simultaneously, and it's very, even though it's like an obvious call, but it's very reminiscent of just like obviously at the start of the month, whatever the results are, there's going to be one half of the population that's extremely
Uh,
overjoyed and like hopeful and exuberant, and there's going to be one half of the population that's extremely um, angry and frustrated and depressed and
Fearful.
pessimistic. Yeah,
Yeah.
fearful. Exactly. And I was watching a like a political commentator on like PBS or something yesterday, and they were talking about how the primary motivators in politics are these four emotions of, on the one hand, enthusiasm and hope, and on the other hand, anger and fear. And this was in a completely non-astrological context, but I was really fascinated by that and that reflection and just how that, coincides with some of our primary meanings of the two benefics, Venus and Jupiter, and the two malefics, Mars and Saturn. Especially like Mars is literally anger and Saturn is fear, are like literally our primary keywords for those two planets.
Yeah, and consistent in text for thousands of years.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not like somebody just associated anger with Mars 20 years ago or fear with Saturn 100 years ago. Like our very earliest strata of texts have those delineations anchored to those planets.
Right. Yeah, so it's like you get both of those right at the beginning of the month. And I think for people in general, especially as you're saying, people that have personal planets close to those degrees, there's going to be one side of that axis that you're going to could be feeling more or less, especially as it personally pertains to you. And that was one of the things that we're going to focus on during the course of this episode is just trying to talk about what the astrology itself is saying as much as we can even though we know the election is going on and we have to contextualize it in that context, but also in terms of people's personal experience of it, but also in terms of us trying to just like describe what the astrology is saying as clearly as we can on its own terms.
Yeah, we're going to try to do that. We've been trying to do that. It's when we were talking about this yesterday, I paralleled it to flying on instruments because it's so windy and visually disruptive that you're not only not getting information by looking out the window, you may get a false impression of, your altitude or speed by looking out the window. And so, yeah, I think, uh, you know, given how high the winds are, it's definitely time to try to fly on instruments astrologically.
Right. And flying on instruments here would be just like looking at the aspects and trying to give keywords for those. And then that's going to be the most striking thing once everything actually plays out. So let's give some keywords on the one hand for the Venus Jupiter opposition that's happening at the beginning of the month. So I said like hope, optimism, um, feelings of like growth and expansion, especially because it's happening in like Gemini and Sagittarius. Also, ideas of like movement as part of that notion of expansion, I think are really prominent themes when it comes to that axis.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, enthusiasm. Yeah, Jupiter gives enthusiasm and hope. The two benefics together give like reward, feelings of victory or like triumph after a great struggle, right? Like the peace of having won after having participated in a great contest. And yeah, with Venus and Sagittarius, like Venus in fire signs in general just gives a lot of exuberance, right? And I think Sagittarius may be the most exuberant of the fire signs. People can weigh in, but it's certainly it certainly is exuberant, if not the most exuberant. And so yeah, there's a
I
lot
mean,
of being ready
as
to
a
celebrate. Oh yeah,
as a
you're a
V
Venus. Yeah, go ahead.
as a Venus in Sagittarius, I mean, I'm known for being very exuberant. So I think that that confirms what you're saying there.
Well, I would argue that it's in your 11th house and that you have a very exuberant audience or fan base, and that you
That's
you have
true.
outsourced that, as that is not the ruler of the ascendant or sect light.
That's
But
true.
exuberance is present in the native's life.
That's fair. I do import that exuberance into my life. That's a good point. So yeah, that Venus transit through Sagittarius, it has reception with Jupiter, so it's trying to empower Jupiter a little bit. Jupiter is retrograde in Gemini, so sometimes the downside of like Jupiter in Gemini can be an overabundance of like words and communication and getting like oversaturated with too much talking, too much communication like taking place at that point. Maybe that's like everybody like reaching their limit, just in terms of like the end of this and just how many words and how much information is being like thrown at you constantly and hitting a breaking point in terms of that.
Yeah, another Jupiter and Gemini retrograde thing might be over being one's enthusiasm being over reliant on a particular pole taken at a particular time. Like the with Jupiter gets in trouble in Mercury's domain in Gemini by putting too much credence or belief into one set of figures or numbers.
Mm, okay. Yeah, and oppositions, this one of the things with this opposition, but also the other one that we'll talk about in a minute, that oppositions oftentimes manifest externally through other people, because you have that like first house, seventh house relationship. And because when an opposition is taking place, it means that when one planet is rising, another planet is setting over the descendant during the course of that like time period when those two planets are in opposition. So one of them, in order for one of them to become visible by rising, the other one has to become invisible by setting at that time. So you get a lot of stuff that comes out in terms of interpersonal relationships and both the good things that come about as a result of that when you have two people that are raising each other up. And you have the themes of people helping each other out in different ways and having a mutually beneficial or positive interaction with another person or with like a group of people. But sometimes you can have feelings of going like overboard when it comes to that, with being hyper social and yeah, sometimes the pitfalls that come along with over socializing.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. There's also the sort of I guess with downside for both benefics in this configuration, like mutual admiration societies, where I'm only going to say nice things to you and you're only going to say nice things to me. And that's
Mm,
pleasant, but doesn't necessarily generate a picture of reality that will endure outside of that bubble.
right. So that opposition is forming. It's like 2 to 3 degrees away on the new moon on the first. And then, like I said, it goes exact at 20 degrees of Sagittarius and 20 degrees of Gemini on November 3rd. The moon actually swoops through Sagittarius, and Mercury is in Sagittarius. It enters Sagittarius the previous day on the 2nd. So it's really getting emphasized at this point around the time of this opposition. And I think November 3rd is going to be a crucial date that I really wanted to emphasize, both because that more positive opposition is really being activated, but also because on the very same day, the most difficult or more difficult opposition is being activated at the same time, which is Mars hitting late 29 degrees of Cancer and opposing Pluto at 29 degrees of Capricorn. So this is an aspect that we've talked a lot about over the course of the past year because we've been paying attention to those hard aspects between Mars and Pluto and different world events that have been really negative during some of those times. So Mars especially is the planet of like conflict and war and aggression and anger, especially like psychologically, whereas Pluto is the planet of extremes, the planet of taking things too far. It can also be a planet of like control, power plays, and manipulation. And putting these two planets in an opposition where sometimes they manifest as those in those interpersonal relationships as like other people in a person's life can be really tough because it sets up some really intense conflicts, basically.
Yeah, it sure can. Yeah, we've got a variety of negative dynamics that can form around Mars Pluto oppositions. And as Chris said, we've been talking about this one a lot because this is the first of three that we're going to get over the next 6 months. But this is the only one that occurs in Cancer and Capricorn, right? So even though it's part of a series, it also has a unique identity because this configuration will not resume in this pair of signs. The other two will be in Aquarius and Leo. Um, with with one of the things you get from this is Pluto. Pluto likes one of the things Pluto likes to do is to silence or negate, and so Mars does not like being shushed um, or negated. And so you get this sort of Pluto attempting to hold Mars down and Mars getting more and more like irritated and I can't take it anymore. And so, which creates, of course, the opposite of silence, right? Like an outburst or like, I can't fucking take it anymore. And so you have this sort of like, you have this pushing down a basketball into a pool. Like the further down you push it, the second you take your hands off, the more it's going to fly up into the sky. And so there's literal tension there. Um, and then when they work together, right, we have attempts at warfare or aggressive action or actions taken to win a contest, which is Mars, right? Mars shows up whenever there's a dynamic where there's a winner and a loser. Um, and so we have Mars presiding over conflicts, and then Pluto can also add that sort of shadow realm element to it, where whatever aggressive actions or actions taken to win take place in an area that is not visible, that is behind the threshold of daylight perception, right? So you get sneaky power plays would be a way to abbreviate that. And this is applicable to the world, but we also see this in people's personal lives. And it's important, if this is hitting your chart really closely, um, to make sure that you're, how should we say, to try to disentangle feelings of powerlessness or being negated or paranoia in relationships from actual toxic dynamics. It because even though Mars Pluto can and will bring about these things or bring those elements to the surface, Pluto also has a way of pulling our focus to a single point to the degree that we can't see other things, and can distort our perception or idea of things, right? Like there may be elements of a relationship that are like that, but it's not the whole thing. But that Mars Pluto brings stuff up.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes that can be empowering in the sense of like coming into one's power and having to push back against extreme forms of bad things that are happening in your life, whether it be like injustices or whether it be anger or aggression or attempts to manipulate or control you that are happening from external sources or from your circumstances. And sometimes the need to push back against that more vigorously and more assertively than you're used to doing. Um, but sometimes that can be like necessary when you're in extreme circumstances to do that and to step into that. And oftentimes Pluto puts you in situations where you don't have a choice but to do that in some instances, so that it's not even necessarily optional, but sometimes it's like compulsory.
Yeah, yeah. And just further on kind of working with that, if it's coming up in your chart or life, um, when Pluto is acting as a negative oppressive force by transit or in the nativity, um, the character, the character of Pluto is often to be, it's very Voldemort, he whose name shall not be spoken. And so being able to sort of engaging some of the useful fantasy cliches of being able to name the demon or to identify what it is that is holding you back or holding you down, like that, bringing something into the visible and into the thinkable, rather than that sort of murky, omnidirectional, oppressive place, is very often a characteristic of working through a Pluto opposition.
Okay. Yeah. Bringing it into light in a sense. So that opposition takes place, and then Mars immediately moves into the sign of Leo after that, where it's going to spend a couple of months. And this is really crucial because I think this is going to be a huge tone change that takes place on November 3rd. And part of the reason why I think that is that the last two Mars ingresses that have taken place over the past few months have also been massive tonal changes. One of them occurred when Mars ingressed into Gemini. And right at that time is when Biden stepped down and Harris became the nominee. Harris has Gemini rising, and so Mars moved into her rising sign. And then all of a sudden, there was just this explosion of activity and social media posts and other things surrounding her for pretty much like that month that Mars was moving through Gemini. It was like a very distinctive period. And then um, eventually, Mars changed signs and moved into Cancer. And all of a sudden, we had a much different tone, a much different tonal shift that took place at that point. And that's what we've been in over the course of the past month or two since Mars has been transiting through Cancer. But now we're getting ready for another major tone shift that's going to take place on November 3rd.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things about this month is that from November 3rd, the moment that Mars enters Leo, until I believe it's November 19th, the second that Pluto enters Aquarius, that ongoing Mars-Pluto opposition is broken by the sign boundaries. They're no longer in opposed signs. Sure, they're still they're still opposed by degree, but the signs matter, and so it's a little over 2 weeks where that Mars Pluto, like that tension that we just described, is absent, or has, at least has the volume turned down. Which, one, I look forward to on a personal level, and then two, it's going to be a little eerie because it's coming back. And so, in watching events, important events in the world, I'm wondering whether there may not be a lull where things seem like they're going to be fine before the Mars Pluto opposition resumes on the 19th.
Yeah, I mean, there's something that definitely starts happening and comes up later in the month. And I agree with that from a different angle because of the Mercury retrograde that starts when Mercury slows down and stations in Sagittarius, stations retrograde on the 25th. And then we start like a 3 week Mercury retrograde period, um, of which an important turning point, the Cazimi halfway through on like December 5th is going to coincide with Mars stationing retrograde in Leo. So, and the shadow period of Mercury when it actually enters into the degree that it will later retrograde back to, that starts on the 7th. So there's something that starts like building up slowly, like immediately after the election, and then um, starts being revisited because the retrogrades are always oftentimes about looking backwards, about revising something, going back into the past, sometimes like arguing something and just like throwing things up in the air, leading to delays and other things like that. And that's one of the curious things is, in the last election, Mercury stationed on election day, and that coincided with it stationed square Saturn, so that coincided with like huge delays in determining like the outcome of the election and things like that, and like counting up the votes or recounting them and different things like that. And while we don't have a station here on election day, we do have Mercury entering its shadow degree immediately after, basically, so that it's setting up something that's going to be revisited a few weeks later.
Yeah, I would feel much calmer about this election if I didn't know what happened just a couple weeks later. And that
Right.
it's Mercury having entered the shadow, which will return that degree that it will return to in December, and with the Mars Pluto, the breaking of the Mars Pluto opposition being very temporary, and that it's back not only for one more go, but it's back, and it's back for months, and won't really be done until we get to next spring. And
Right.
so I don't know, it's some of that eye of the storm energy that we saw last month. I'm expecting, I don't know, like I don't know what to expect, but the astrology looks like that for this first part of November.
Yeah. And in terms of people's like personal lives, so Mercury hits that degree on November 7th, which is 6 degrees of Sagittarius, and then it will retrograde back to that degree. It'll return back to that degree several weeks later on December 15th. So it's like if you have a personal planet, especially around 6 degrees of Sagittarius, or even 6 degrees of the other mutable signs, then there's something that's being activated by that initial pass of Mercury at the beginning of November that you're then later going to have to revisit um, in the middle of December when Mercury comes back to that degree. And then the entire thing is not going to be finished and kind of wrapped up until eventually Mercury departs from its post retrograde shadow period in early January. Mercury hits that final shadow degree January 2nd. So there's this just a sequence of things like playing out over a several week period beginning in early November.
Yeah, and to speak to that opposite, the Mercury Jupiter a little bit more, the Mercury and Sag, Mercury's time in Sag is going to echo some of the Venus Jupiter, in that Mercury in Sagittarius will also be in a Jupiter ruled sign, But unlike Venus, Mercury and Jupiter will be in each other's signs and exchanging, and so mutual reception. And so that enthusiasm that we were talking about with Jupiter will absolutely be present in the messaging, right? The messaging component, which is Mercury's, and so it really like in a on a personal level as well as probably on a collective level. Um, I will be careful about announcing anything too enthusiastically or signaling my complete and total triumph, right? Like that Mercury Jupiter is such it's such a good news configuration. And so I would suggest people be just a little wait and see if you get news that sounds too good to be true, or if you feel like announcing something too good to be true, maybe a little wait and see, because that Mercury's pending retrograde in that condition is just it promises that promises some degree of walk back or reversal around like enthusiastic, positive, victorious messages.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so it's going to be in Sagittarius. Sagittarius, of course, is like the rising sign of the United States. So that's tricky. Um, One of the things about the Mercury retrograde, actually, even though we're getting ahead of ourselves and we're talking about something that happens later in the month with the Mercury retrograde, maybe now is the time to mention this. But I just noticed today that when Mercury stations later in the month, it actually stations square Neptune, which actually complicates that configuration even more and makes it that retrograde even more annoying than it already was going to be. Because we can see here around November 26th, Mercury stations at 22 Sagittarius, and Neptune, of course, is at 27 degrees of Pisces. So that's like 5 degrees off, but that's still pretty close for a square. And that means that part of the Mercury retrograde station is going to be tinged with Neptune. And when Mercury and Neptune get together, there's pretty much always issues of like deception, of misdirection, of lying, of different
being
things.
and being confused and wrong, like bad information, both intentional and unintentional.
Right. But sometimes, and in Sagittarius, with Mercury and Sagittarius, especially, sometimes being like certain about something, but being like
Yeah.
very confident, but confidently wrong.
Yeah, that's definitely like the big centaur energy with Mercury.
Right.
Just,
Yeah.
centaur style proclaiming, galloping through the town, doing a pole revere, but as a centaur.
And also
Somebody
like,
somebody make an AI thing of that, please.
right. But also telling a good tale, like Mercury in Sagittarius is a tale teller and is good at coming up with stories and stuff like that. But because it's opposite to its own domicile in Gemini, which is more of like the reporter, Mercury is in Sagittarius is more of the storyteller. But the details of that are not always actually very accurate per se. It's more like
Yeah.
giving a feeling of something.
Yeah, well, or you can, like, in a sense, all myths are always true, but they are not factual. And confusing the truth of any sort of mythic storyline with the facts of a situation.
Right. Yeah. Um, Yeah, I saw a clip of somebody trying to convince someone recently of dragons being true and the question of whether dragons actually exist versus don't exist and whether the idea of a dragon existing was sufficient to say that it exists.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it exists in the mind, in a shocking number of places that never talk to each other about it, right? But the existence, it's interesting. I've thought about that a lot. Like it's interesting that in the Chinese zodiac, dragon is the only creature that's not real, right? Everything
Mm,
else is like, oh, it's a rat, it's a snake, it's a sheep, right? And then dragon, right? And Kate's a dragon, so she gives me shit about having the by far best animal. I'm like, it would be great, that it would be the best animal if it existed. Like, I'm a triple sheep in my four pillars, And you know, the what the sheep has over the dragon is that sheep actually exist.
Right. Well, and that's the funny thing about like the nodes, for example, being associated with dragons,
Yeah.
but then it's like then you go to like India or somewhere and you see the symbol for the nodes being on the back of a snake's head, and you
Hmm.
realize that that's actually probably the original inspiration, but it sort of gets worked into something bigger, into like a big flying dragon, with scales instead of just a little snake that slithers.
Yeah, and magic powers. They get pretty big, right? Like the king cobras can be 18 feet long, which would feel like a dragon if one slid up to you. But the nodes themselves are also a huge deal, and yet they don't exist. They're calculated points of intersection between sun, earth, moon's orbit, but you can't fly a rocket up to the nodes and land on them. Like they don't exist, but they do. Like, is shadow a thing? Right?
Right.
Shadow changes things, but you can't grasp shadow. You can't weigh it. You can't land a rocket on it.
Yeah. So, anyway, this Mercury station square Neptune, it sets up a sequence of events that's really important over the next 3 weeks. Because what I noticed is one, at the halfway point in the Mercury retrograde cycle, which is the Cazimi, when Mercury conjoins the Sun at about 14 degrees of Sagittarius on December 5th, that is basically like 24 hours from when Mars stations at 6 degrees of Leo. So the Mercury Cazimi halfway through that retrograde cycle coincides with the Mars station. And that coincidence means that's going to be a really important turning point around December 6th and 7th. And then weirdly, when Mercury stations direct, and we're getting into December transits here, but when Mercury stations direct around December 15th, it's the same day as a full moon in the sign of Gemini. So I'm really going to be looking for, we're going to end this forecast on a cliffhanger basically, because the
Oh
Mercury
yeah.
the Mercury retrograde that starts building on November 7th and then really gets going later this month on the 25th and 26th, it's going to set up a sequence of events that's not going to conclude until later in December.
Yeah, that's absolutely the right structure. It's kind of November has the November kind of feels like a trick because after October has just been building and building towards the US election, but all these other things are beginning more and more intense. And and a lot of that is the Mars-Pluto opposition coming to perfection in early November. We also happen to have the US election there, but actually things kind of de-intensify and we don't really get like the story we thought we were like the climax we thought we were going to get at the beginning of the month. Whereas the last third of November, I would say starting with the Pluto's reingress into Aquarius and Mercury coming up on that station, and then early December's Mars station right around the corner. That's where like that's where the spectacular, horrifying, exciting story stuff is. Like I think there's going to be a little bit of a by the end of the first week of and some the end of the first week of November. It just doesn't look crazy, whereas the end looks like the crazy we were promised. Do you agree with that, Chris?
I mean, I think that it's true that things are going to ramp up and intensify in a way that's surprising and takes us into a new chapter. And I do think you're right that there's going to be a little separation between Mars and Pluto once Mars changes signs, but it's like it's that opposition's still so close on election day. I mean, look at this. Like Mars is at 0 Leo and Pluto's at 29 Capricorn. So even though they have changed signs, it gives some distance until Pluto starts pursuing Mercury later in the month. That's still pretty intense opposition that's going to be experienced. It's not usually until a planet gets like a degree or at least like 2 or 3 degrees away from an exact aspect like that that you really start to get a full breather. And I'm not sure that.
No, oh no, yeah, I'm not foretelling a great peace settling upon the land for 2 weeks. It's just
Right.
that it's not the ignition spark climax. Like that's delayed. There's a
Yeah,
holding tension between Mars and Pluto, but they're not quite configured, right? And every day Mars actually gets a little further from Pluto. Not much, like not enough to dissolve the tension, but it's getting a little further from opposition until, of course, it all clicks back in.
for sure. Yeah. And especially just because that Mars, we know that Mars retrograde doesn't really start fully until early December, and both candidates have Mars in Leo. So this Mars retrograde that's already like tense and problematic, that has the opposition with Pluto, and where you have these strong conflicting energies, that Mars return to Leo is a Mars return for both candidates, which is just super striking. It's going to be in Trump's rising sign, and it's going to be in Harris's third house of communication. And I was looking back through history. I was trying to look at like other instances of people with Mars and Leo and other things like that. And one of them that I found that was really striking today is I found out that both President Truman and also Emperor Hirohito were both born with Mars in Leo, and they were both born with Mars not long after it had stationed direct in Leo. So just coming off of a Mars retrograde in Leo. And then what's weird is that Mars then went retrograde in Leo and Cancer in late 1945 and early 1946, which was just in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And it was when Japan was still, that fall was like negotiating its surrender, and where Hirohito was pushed into having to make a decree that he was not divine, or that the emperor was no longer a god. And that was such a striking, like Mars retrograde for both of those people um, in Leo and Cancer, and to have that be, baked into their birth charts. There's something about that that's very reminiscent here, as we have these two candidates that are about to have the most important event and election of their lives take place, while Mars is getting ready to go retrograde in the natal sign that they were born with it in.
Yeah, yeah. The loser has to renounce their divinity. Um, no, but and there's another piece that makes this retrograde rhyme with that one, which is that at that time, in the mid 40s, Pluto was in Leo, so it was Mars with Pluto in Leo as opposed to Mars opposite Pluto in Leo, but it was Mars Pluto during the retrograde. In that case, of the conjunction, the destruction was much more immediate and obvious, right? As that retrograde took place right after Mars was in Gemini and conjoined Uranus, which was the deployment of nuclear weapons by Truman upon the land that Hirohito was emperor of, and that was when the Sun was in Leo on Pluto on both their Marses.
Mhm. Right. That's a good point. Yeah. And then, of course, just coming off of that Mars retrograde later in the spring of 1946, that's when Trump was born. And he was born with Mars just post that Mars retrograde in Leo, just after that Mars
Oh,
retrograde as it was coming out. So he's closely tied in with this specific Mars retrograde period, which is then going to be in his rising sign. Um, yeah. So with both of them, obviously Mars transits can coincide with periods of like anger, conflict, um, having altercations, having like fights. Mars is also the classic planet of like war and things like that. And we've been talking a lot about the first Mars-Pluto opposition because it takes place at the beginning of the month, very near to election day. But what's unfortunate also, and is a little foreboding, is that the second Mars-Pluto opposition, once Mars goes retrograde in Leo and Pluto moves into Aquarius, is that the second opposition takes place in early January, which is again going to be very close to when they're certifying the votes, basically, when Congress is certifying the votes, which is going to happen on January 6th again. So that immediately seems foreboding in terms of just remembering what happened like 4 years ago and what that looked like.
Yeah, I mean Mars re-entering Cancer on January 6th. That's what I suppose the fourth anniversary, or the fourth or the third January 6th after the first one. Um, we don't want to see big Mars action on January 6th.
Right.
Um, and then we don't get the last Mars Pluto opposition until the end of April.
I know April keeps coming up over and over again, and I do not know why, because I would be shocked, just practically speaking, if there's still stuff from this that's all playing out still by the time of April, but it almost like implies that there's something that's still playing out about all of this stuff that starts in like November and December at the beginning of the Mars retrograde and the Mars Pluto oppositions, and that there's something about it that's not finally fully completed until this period in like around April, because it's also
Yep.
around April that both of their charts are getting activated in weird ways. We start having eclipse season again. There's something going on.
Yeah, and March, April is kind of one chaotic unit, right? It's the right Neptune enters Aries, pair of eclipses in Aries and Virgo. And there's not only is there a Venus retrograde in Aries that comes back into Pisces, Mercury retrogrades at about the same time. So we've got Mercury retrograde and Venus retrograde in Aries coming back to Pisces while Neptune's moving in. Like it's a carnival cyclone. And it's very interesting that it's towards the end of that we see the last Mars Pluto. And I think it would be I don't know, smart to 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 acknowledge that there are almost certainly big pieces. There's like some big event or big events that impact all of this that we can't see from here that make this such a long drawn out deal. Um,
Right.
or I would bet very strongly on something that I don't know and can't see from here, making the astrology look the way it does. Um, 'Cause it's yeah, it feels like there's a piece missing.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and just in terms of both of their birth charts, it's like Mars is going into Trump's rising sign, and that's the first house. So usually the first house represents your mind and your character, but also your body and your physical vitality and things like that. Having Mars going into that house then can sometimes cause challenges for both of those things. Whether it's in terms of your mind and being more irritated or angry or agitated, or your body. And that's some of the things we've associated with some of the like major health issues that he's had over the past several months with those two attempts. Was Uranus squaring his Mars in the first house around that
Which
time.
Uranus is not done doing for until midway through past April of next year. The Uranus is just hanging out in late Taurus. Like that doesn't go away.
Right. So it's like that's some of that energy for him, either psychologically or physically. And then for her, her Mars is natally in the third house of like communication, short distance travel, siblings, neighbors. But Mars going into your third house usually would be just psychologically like arguing, fighting, having to be more verbally combative about something, having to be more assertive or aggressive in terms of your communication style. The third house is short distance travel, and sometimes there can be um, problems that one runs into in terms of traveling. There can be obstacles that come up in terms of travel, but usually from a psychological perspective, it's more about verbal combativeness for some reason.
Yeah, well, and just like lots of little conflicts scattered throughout your regular, like your weekly schedule. Like things in the third just are often you just see it becomes part of what a person's dealing with on the regular.
Right. How do you feel about Mars and Leo in general as an energy that we're getting ready to have like 2 solid months of, just independent of everything else?
Um, Yeah, I mean, so there's like every planet that moves from Cancer to Leo, there's a not just a tonal shift, but almost a inversion. Like Cancer is so private and feelings, it's private and you're just in protecting and cultivating and Mars in Leo or just any planet in Leo, Mars becomes extremely expressive. The Cancer has this inward looking and inward tending towards the private, whereas Mars in Leo, any planet, but additionally Mars becomes so performative and radiant, right? The energy going outward, like radiating, making a scene, making a spectacle, making a big deal of things. I've seen Mars and Leo be an asset for a lot of performers, right? Who have some artistic skill indicated otherwise, but they have an ability to appear very bombastically, right? Like that's that Mars and Leo. Like it's the solar ability to make an appearance and to get people's attention. And he certainly shouldn't be considered as the only example, but Donald Trump with Leo rising, with Mars on the rising in Leo, is a good example of somebody who makes a big appearance. He was sort of a character for decades, like a public character for decades before he had anything to do with politics. Like, it's the Mars and Leo is probably more appropriate for a television show host.
Yeah, showmanship. That's like a
Yeah,
good
that's great.
keyword for Mars and Leo. And
Yeah.
there's some like good versions of that. Like I'm just looking at some Mars and Leo people I see in my files, and we have like Michael J. Fox is a Mars and Leo. Um, who else? Mark Hamill, who's like a Mars and Leo, and he played like, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and that notion of like a hero with 1,000 faces, where you've got the
Yeah.
like hero that has that like long journey that they take.
That's a really good example because that's of the Mars being in the sun's terrain, because that hero's journey structure is very much a solar journey, right? It
Right.
like that's the solar hero.
Yeah. But then it's actually surprising how many politicians there are, even like recent ones. Like Hillary Clinton was also a Mars and Leo. And then so is Al Gore. So that's weird that we had, 2016 was Mars and Leo versus Mars and Leo, and now we've got a repetition of that in 2024 with a Mars and Leo versus Mars and Leo, but this time it's different because Mars is about to go station retrograde in Leo right after the election.
Yep.
All right, so tone shift, yeah, more externalized as well, less of this like internal stuff that we've been doing lately. We talked about like Mars last month, we talked about how Mars in Cancer was like coinciding with like some like weird like nativism and sometimes like turf wars. There's also been like racism that we noted last month that has for sure continued as a theme in terms of Mars and Cancer. And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of that as a theme with Mars in Cancer and like why that can sometimes come up. But
Oh, I
then
mean, with it. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Go
I was
ahead.
just saying, yeah, it's been creeping up on my late Cancer ascendant,
Mm,
and so I've been thinking, I have had to actively fend off like thinking too much about the physical security of the house, because
mm.
now that I have baby, the feelings of vulnerability and the need to feel like protected, right? Like to protect your child and wife and self third. I'm like, oh well, there is a bear that lives around here. There is this, like, what if this happened? Like this kind of thinking of like very I was like cartoon archetype Cancer stuff, like how do I keep my family safe in our house, has been very invasive. And I did get cans of bear spray, as well as some
Okay.
other things, just to satisfy my mind. Like the bear is not a hallucination. I've seen the bear from 20 feet away. He's very large. He's very shaggy. He has not threatened me, but if he was in a bad mood, I would be in trouble.
That's your primary predator in the wild is bears that you have to look out for.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure coyote, like there are definitely packs of coyotes that come in and out of the property. I see them, you can hear them yipping and driving the dogs in the area crazy, but like dude, I'll fight a coyote. Like I'll fuck up some coyotes. I'm not going to fuck up a bear. Um
Yeah, I don't definitely don't want to see that.
But
All right.
I was just speaking to the point about like the really intense feelings, especially with it opposite Pluto of, oh my God, am I safe? Is my family safe? Like that is classic Mars and Cancer.
Yeah, the tendency to want to protect that which is familiar and that which is dear to you, and to sometimes identify as a threat that which is different or that which is unknown. And um, that seems to have been a theme that's come up as like a major thing with Mars and Cancer. That theme is going to actually come back when Mars comes
Yeah.
back into Cancer early next year, which is going to be weird having a return to that. But we're going to get this very splashy 2 month, completely different shift when Mars goes into Leo of a much different energy that's going to be much more similar to like the energy that was happening when Mars was in Gemini the last time it was in diurnal sign, basically for that 2 months. And things were just happening quickly, things were happening fast. There was for sure more of a sense of like exuberance or optimism or other things, which is hard to distinguish because obviously some of that was like the Venus Jupiter sextile that happened around that time. But I wonder if some elements of that aren't don't come back a little bit as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to speak to was the shift of Mars into Leo, like syncs up really nicely with Mercury moving into Sagittarius. Like
Mm,
it's two things moving from water, which is like private and broody and and deep, to fire, right, which externalizes and brings things to the surface, makes them public, goes after things like just that tonal shift by itself of those two planets moving into fire signs is going to be significant for the first part of the month. Another way to describe the shift from Cancer to Leo for Mars is it's very much going on offense. Like Mars in Cancer is like literally I was obsessed with defense. I didn't have one thought of tracking down that bear, right, and give him a good talking to. It was all like defense, right?
right. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's much more proactive, much more go on the attack, much more forward thinking, and more of like shoot first and ask questions later type energy.
Yeah, definitely just offense rather than defense. Like when in doubt, act as opposed to when in doubt, retreat.
Leo is also it's the only fixed fire sign, so it has much more like staying power and much more of a sense of having a permanent sense of that pushing forward, or even that like sometimes burning or irritating notion can be more constant rather than something that just in Cancer as a cardinal sign, it's something that has like an initial push, but then it drops off. Whereas in the fixed signs, it's something that takes longer to get going, but once it does, it has more staying power.
Right, which is going to be kind of an illusion this time, right? Because Mars is going to be gathering fixity and then literally staging a retreat 6 degrees into that sign.
Okay. So maybe it's something that like seems like it's going to have staying power, but then there's like a reversal or having to go back and revisit something from the past.
Right. And then it does go back into Leo, right? And so, like, there's maybe something of that initial fixity, which does endure the entirety of the retrograde.
Mm,
But it's like Mars is doing the opposite of charting a steady course.
right. All right, so we're back from a little break. Let's transition into talking about the next lunation of the month, which is a new moon that takes place, or sorry, it's a full moon that takes place in the sign of Taurus on the 15th of November. And here that is in the planetary alignments calendar. I think this is a really important lunation this month. For one reason, because it takes place the same day that Saturn stations direct at 12 degrees of Pisces. So every one of the Saturn stations so far as ever since Saturn went into Pisces back in early 2023, has coincided with an intensification of the meaning of Saturn in that sign. And we've seen some pretty important turning points take place with respect to Saturn and Pisces. The first and most notable and like memorable one, of course, was the Titan submarine disaster that occurred when Saturn first stationed in Pisces. And we had this like talk for like a week in the media of like fears about being trapped in a submarine. Um, so that's on that one hand, one thing that comes up on that lunation. The other thing, though, is that this is a full moon that is closely conjunct Uranus and has a major Uranian vibe of unpredictability, of disruptions, of things being unstable or even destabilized. Here's that full moon. It goes exact at 24 degrees of Taurus on the 15th. And we can see that Uranus is at 25 degrees of Taurus. So the next aspect that the moon makes after completing the opposition with the sun is that conjunction with Uranus, making it the primary signature of this lunation. And there's just something surprising. There's some sort of curveball or something unexpected about this full moon that takes place at this point right in the middle of the month.
Yeah, there's some potentially nasty twists that are portended by that. Um, and it is also further, it's also worth noting that Uranus is still on the star Coppock, which has a lot of dire significations. And so the full moon being on Algol would be worth noting in of itself, but it's that same Uranus Algol combination that Mars activated in the middle of July. So yeah, definitely curveball full moon. I think a lot of potential to disrupt, as you said, would be a good way to talk about it, which is a little frustrating because usually the full moon in Taurus, it's the moon's exaltation, and Taurus is a fixed sign, it's an earth sign. And so usually the full moon in Taurus is a note of stabilization, right? And so this full moon, whose normal job is to be stabilizing, is this year quite destabilizing.
Right. So best case scenario, let's talk about people's personal lives. I mean, a full moon conjunct Uranus, it could be like usually tensions are running high during a full moon. Like, we always hear those anecdotes about people that work at hospitals saying that hospitals are more busy during full moons. But sometimes it's just a culmination of events. For individuals, if you have stuff, if Taurus is important to you, especially around those degrees, maybe it's just doing something unexpected, doing something different, having a culmination of events that turns out differently than what you planned. But
Mhm.
sometimes that can be okay. Sometimes it can be excitement. It can be a really exciting thing that's like different than your normal day-to-day routine. And that can feel, you can have feelings of like liberation and being like breaking free from previous restrictions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's plot twist, and plot twists don't have to be for the worst. It's just that they're inconvenient, but sometimes it's, oh God, I gotta wake up and go to school. Um, school burned down. Nobody died, but no school for 3 months. Yay.
Mm, right. Yeah. Um,
Or there's a crazy water leak, or or something. Sometimes it can be a disruption that's not generally an amazing thing for the world, but is not necessarily horror themed. And it's like, actually it's great. I didn't oh, that restaurant closed. I didn't want to go to that restaurant anyway. Right. Let's go put tater tots in the oven. Tourist themes.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned water leak because that's the other major theme that will probably become prominent during that time is something about water, the ocean, and other things like that keeps coming up as
Mhm.
like a prominent theme every time Saturn stations over the course of the past year, year and a half now. Other times we've had like floods and things like that. Um, have there been like positive water things that have happened? Like I'm trying to remember when some of these Saturn stations have occurred because a lot of it's been about like the negative side of Saturn. So we've seen stories about like water pollutants, or I think one of the stations was something about like everything chemicals, and laws being
in the
passed.
water.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that was in April at the Mars-Saturn conjunction. I think that was when you're away. But there was both flooding, but also there were the first laws that were passed in the US against forever chemicals, like around the time of the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Pisces.
yeah, I think if there were positive things, they were good reactions to negative things. Like,
Yes.
oh, like this report was published, which shows that this is not good. Let's do something about the not good to limit the damage going forward.
Right. So in that instance, it was like putting restrictions, like saying no to something and putting up boundaries, but ones that are productive and like positive and good. So in terms of people's personal lives, especially since this is a direct station and for many people, Saturn's like returning back to a degree at 12 degrees of Pisces that it visited previously, it may be returning back to a topic that you already dealt with earlier this year, especially around the last time Saturn passed 12 degrees of Pisces, and maybe putting in some constructive boundaries or saying no to something, like returning back to a topic and deciding that it's okay to say no to something or it's okay to reject something that you don't feel is serving you at this point in your life and that you don't necessarily want to include, could be one theme.
Yeah, yeah. Or in addition to that, as someone who Saturn has been crossing back and forth over my sun in my chart, which is my sect light. And so this year I've had to be much more disciplined and structured than I've ever had to be in my life. And so a lot of that is experimentation because I've never done this before. I've never like done, all my work, et cetera, et cetera. And tried to be an active father and this and that. And so there's been a lot of experimenting with frameworks, right? Like, how do I structure my day? How do I structure, my fulfillment of my obligations? And so playing around with and trying out different structures has been a big part of that. And I can see I feel like we're about to station direct. I feel like I've tried a lot of things and I know which ones are working and which aren't going to work for this period of my life. Sometimes Saturn's direct station is sort of confirming that this will work and that won't work, and this needs to be your structure in this area moving forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So positive structures, and that kind of goes along with one of my favorite aspects, and one of the most positive aspects this month occurs a little bit after that, but it's related. It's Venus is going to ingress into Capricorn by like November 11th, and after that point, it's going to apply to make a sextile with Saturn, which is eventually going to go exact and complete around November 21st. And in a month that has so much challenging stuff. Like at the beginning of the month, you have the Mars Pluto opposition. Later in the month, you have the Mercury retrograde. This is one of my aspects that I kind of like this month because it feels a little bit grounding, where you have Venus sextiling Saturn with reception, which builds a closer connection between Venus and Saturn than there would be otherwise, as a result of that reception. And because the sextile is usually a weak aspect, I think that's going to help to reinforce some of those positive, constructive ideas of setting boundaries and structures that help you and are supportive or nourishing in some way that you were just talking about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you're right. Yeah, yeah. That Saturn, like building, building structure, building discipline, building schedule that's livable, right? It's not just like, because it's one thing to imagine that like I'm gonna wake up at 5 a.m. and I'm gonna get all this stuff done, um, and finding out that it's supremely unlivable, right? In order to build life structure, it needs to be not so. It needs to be not unendurable to inhabit, right? It needs to be like, oh, this is not so bad, right? Like, yes, there's a lot of have tos and don't do's, but like this is actually a good schedule, right? And that
Yeah.
Venusian element to like the Saturnian discipline.
And sometimes Venus is about finding pleasures and things. So maybe Venus in Capricorn sextiling Saturn is like finding pleasures and setting up within the constraint of setting up those regular
Mhm.
schedules and those regular boundaries. And once established, finding things that are enjoyable about that you actually appreciate.
Yeah, I think of good Venus Saturn relations as very whistle while you work.
Nice. I like that. I like that. All right. So those are some of the major things happening around there. There may be some like problematic water stories in the news. I would actually bet on it around that time, around the 15th. So we'll pay attention to that. But the other major thing that's happening is Pluto is departing from Capricorn and moving into
Hmm.
Aquarius on the 19th, where it's going to stay for the next 2 decades. So that's another really major mundane astrological shift in terms of world astrology that we've been looking forward to for the past few years now, because it's been like Pluto's been going back and forth between Capricorn and Aquarius for a bit now, and we're finally at the end of one transit and are fully going to enter into the beginning of another.
Yeah, and so this, even though we've had a couple ingresses and regresses, this is the for keeps ingress, like not going back to Capricorn for 237 years. And so very often with outer planets, with these slow moving outer planets such as Pluto, the for keeps ingress where it's not a sizzle reel, it's not a trailer, it's not a preview, it's just the way it is from this day forward, often are accompanied by interesting and interesting events which are symbolic of the future in their shape.
Hmm. Yeah. We're going to have to pay attention to those. We've already seen previews of some of that over the past few years as Pluto's been dancing back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn. You and I were talking the other day, and I'm surprised at how you get both. Like, we're getting some extremely dystopian things, which you were not surprised by, but I've been become increasingly like surprised at the like weird, negative, dystopian, futuristic things that are taking place. In addition to, of course, I've been noting some of the more positive ones over the past few years as well, but I'm a little weirded out that some of the like negative dystopian ones from sci-fi are actually happening at this point. Like we have like, you know, billionaires and like and some of the richest people in the world like very explicitly controlling the media that millions of people are consuming in very like overt and very obviously like manipulative ways. And some of that, especially in the news over the past few months, has weirded me out like a lot, that's the version of the future that we're in to some extent.
Yeah. Again, you didn't binge enough cyberpunk dystopia stuff when you were younger. What's interesting is
I mean,
that
I did, but I always just thought that was like a negative, like uncharitable take on what the future would look like compared to like the 1950s, like Jetsons version of the future where we're all going to have like flying cars and everything's going to be and cool robots and everything's going to be cool.
that's funny. I make the Jetsons car noise, the whenever I fly Lucian around.
Nice.
But just what's kind of interesting about those like sort of frightening cyberpunk dystopias is most of those visions came out or were written during the Saturn Pluto conjunction in Libra in the early 80s, and that was right after a Saturn Jupiter conjunction in Libra, which was a preview of the 200 years of air, which didn't actually begin until 2020. And so the timing for a lot of those visions it was the perfect time to look at the 2020s before you even got to the century. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting in terms of that conjunction in the early 80s and stuff and different eras of sci-fi and different versions of that. I mean, the 80s was interesting because there were some of the like dirty versions of sci-fi in some of the shows like I'm trying to think of like Blade Runner had that like a
Yep.
little bit, or
Oh,
even
yeah, a
s-
lot.
even Star
And
Wars to a certain extent.
what's interesting about Blade Runner is William Gibson was writing his trilogy, which was sort of central to defining what cyberpunk is, and that like corporate dystopia. It's more than that, but that was a big element of it. And he was just about done with the first book when Blade Runner came out, and he was like, "Fuck, everybody's going to think I copied off of Blade Runner." But it was
Mhm.
just time for that particular like neon grim high tech high tech thing to happen. There's a great quote from the writer, I believe his name's Mike McGee, of the cyberpunk role playing game, which then became a video game that came out right as the Jupiter Saturn conjunction occurred in late 2020. But he said what cyberpunk is, you're not trying to save the world, you're trying to save yourself from the world. And I think I slightly fucked that up, but that's basically what it is. Like, you're not trying to save the world, you're trying to save yourself from the world. And that is the like tonality of it.
Yeah, well, that's what I had to ask is like, so the cyberpunk dystopia scenarios, one of the themes is setting up these huge, like, mega corporations of the future that are controlled by very few people that influence the masses, especially through technology, and sometimes the soullessness of technology and different things like that. But then what is the positive things then that are empowering? Like there's another side of that, which is often like the people that the lower level people that like learn to use and to leverage technology or even to like hack technology in order to empower themselves is like the other part of that in terms of the dystopian sci-fi futures.
Yeah, I would say that's what makes it cyberpunk rather than, that rebellion against the way things are, utilizing the technologies that are available rather than just cyber dystopia, right? And so you see, I guess in those stories, you have individual empowerment through technological means as well as other means. Like that's where all of the images of like cybernetically enhanced people come from. That's where all of the sort of visions that would become Neo in the Matrix started 20 years before that, of like using an internet that was largely theoretical at the time, to achieve things that an individual could not otherwise. But the cyberpunk genre is very noir in the sense that it's often tragic and it doesn't end with saving the world.
Mm. Okay.
And so it's sort
Well,
of a vision of the future that doesn't lead naturally into another stage of what the world looks like.
Well, that may be part of the limitations then, since we know that this, you know, will there will be another stage, obviously, after Pluto and Aquarius, for example, whatever Pluto and Pisces is about. But with Pluto and Aquarius, then part of that may be learning to the need to, in moving into a new era, learning the new technologies and learning their capabilities and becoming proficient in that. That way you can have a greater sense of personal autonomy by being able to like reverse or like hack those things and to be able to work inside of the system, even if you're working like against it or like some themes like that.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be going to be really visible once we get into Uranus and Gemini. I think that adds the punk part, which is the using the tools available to create a life that has a shape that's not factory settings, right? That like sort of bottom up push in repurposing rather than, everything just being an Apple product.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, yeah, Pluto into Aquarius on the 19th, we're going to have to pay close attention to what happens around the time of that ingress, because sometimes, like you said, there can be major news stories. I just keep thinking back to how the first ingress of Pluto into Capricorn coincided with like the banking crisis, like the initial worldwide recession with the housing crisis and everything else, but also the seeds of some things that would develop over the next like 15 to 20 years, like the creation of Bitcoin happened at the beginning of that and everything else. So we're looking at something similar now. We can already see the emergence of some of that through just the rapid advancements in artificial intelligence, robotics, um, human machine interfaces that are starting to take place, the commercialization of space flight, and so many other technological things that have just been going bonkers the past few years as Pluto's been making its way into Aquarius, start to become fully unleashed at this point.
Yeah, yeah. We've been sort of, yeah, edging back and forth towards all of those technologies. Like they're here, but they're not. But they're here, but they're not. But they're here, but they're not.
Right. Um, all right. And I should highlight the election for the month before I forget to. So the auspicious election this month. Okay, so I have to preface I have to preface this one before I show this chart. Um, this month, there's that great like Venus Pluto or Venus Jupiter opposition at the beginning of the month, but you can't really use it because it's taking place at the same time as a Mars Pluto opposition. So that kind of puts elections towards the beginning of the month out. Then later in the month, you get the Mercury retrograde. So you're kind of in a difficult position. So the chart that I wanted to recommend this month is for later in the month. If you have to do something while Mercury is stationing retrograde, then I'm going to give you a chart to use to sort of get the best in from that and to sort of lean into it. So our electional chart this month is on November 26th at about 9 a.m. And let me share that for those watching the video version. So November. All right. So this is basically pretty much the day that Mercury stations retrograde. So we see Mercury stationing at 22 degrees of Sagittarius, opposite Jupiter. The primary thing about this election that we're going for is just having Capricorn rising in your location, Saturn ruling the ascendant, and it's direct. It's in the third house. It's in a day chart. It still has that nice sextile from Venus at 17 degrees of Capricorn that I was talking about earlier, that's so affirming in terms of creating structural things.
Hmm?
And Saturn also has a square from Jupiter, which is over there at 17 degrees of Gemini. So the primary thing about this chart is just the moon is up there in Libra in the 10th house, and it's applying to both a square with Venus with reception, since the moon is in Venus's sign, and the moon is also applying to a trine with Jupiter from 14 degrees of Libra into 17 degrees of Gemini. So the primary thing we're going for with this chart is just it's even though Mercury's stationing retrograde, it's a day in which the moon is well configured to both benefics, and you can get a halfway decent rising sign with Capricorn ruling the ascendant and Venus in the first house. It's also just about as far away this month as I can get an electional chart from the Mars-Pluto opposition, which is also very important in terms of if you're starting anything significant this month. The downside, of course, is obviously if you're starting something around the time that Mercury is stationing retrograde, which you can't avoid in the second half of the month, there is the potential for having to go back and redo things in the future, for having to revisit things that you start during this time. There's a potential for delays or other types of snafus. So that's going to be a potential no matter what towards the end of the month. So you should go into starting anything with that in mind and aware of that as a potential that you may have to redo things. But if you absolutely can't get out of starting something later in the month around the time of the Mercury retrograde, then I would just try to use this chart in order to at least put the moon in the best position that you can. And I think if you do that, you'll be able to navigate the Mercury retrograde with a little bit more success than you would otherwise. If, for example, you use like a couple days later when the moon is squaring Mars or
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that makes sense. That's nice. I like Venus strong in the first, ruling the 10th and the moon. Ruler not too malefic. Also worth noting that in the triplicity scheme, Venus is the ruler of the second decan of Capricorn. Little bonus strength there.
Nice. Nice, nice. Yeah. So this is one of the charts that Lisa Scheinman I found for November. I think we outlined about 8 or 9 other auspicious electional charts in our electional astrology podcast, which is available to patrons through our page at patreon.com/astrology podcast. So if you're looking for other dates this month, you can check that podcast out for more. And in the comments, Nicole says that might be a great day for the December forecast. Nicole has a point there. We may have to record around this time when we do our forecast next month.
Yeah. Yeah. God,
Yeah.
it's been inconvenient lately because there's always something interesting just over the border into the next month. Like, could we record the day after Mars stations?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, we keep pushing our recording date to like the very end of the month as a result of that in order to let as many news stories come in as possible. But yeah, we're gonna have to do this right as the Mercury retrograde is getting going next month.
Sweet.
Yeah. All right. So let me look at our outline and see where we're at. So we covered Pluto and Aquarius. Mercury, of course, is going retrograde in Sag by the 25th. And that's kind of just giving us our cliffhanger ending, which is that we're ending the month with a Mercury retrograde that starts for 3 weeks. The Mars is in Leo, but it's really slowing down at this point because it's getting ready to go retrograde in early December. And when Mars is that close to stationing retrograde, it's really just barely hobbling along at that point and getting ready to pull that U-turn and turn around and start heading backwards.
Yeah, where the month ends less than a week out from Mars' station. And then we've got, I guess, the very last few hours of the month, depending on your time zone, is the new moon in Sagittarius. We could justify dealing with that in the November or the December forecast. It's literally in one or the other, depending on time zone.
Yeah, I had it in December because I did the calendars in the Eastern time zone. Um,
I'm fine with leaving it there.
yeah, I think we may have to.
I, I,
Yeah,
I think it'll lead nicely into the Mars station. I think that would be fun to begin with December with.
yeah, for sure. Because Mars is at like almost 6 by that point, which is the degree it stations in. So that's really a December thing. And yeah, we can see Mercury's retrograde there at 20. Saturn is direct at 12. Pluto is pursuing Mars now that it's in Aquarius, which is one of the tricky things about that ingress that you mentioned, is that ingress is not just a 2 decade long shift, but there's something more immediate about that ingress of Pluto into Aquarius mid-month, mid to late in the month, because then it reestablishes the connection between Mars and Pluto.
Yeah, and then as soon as Mars begins retrograding, they're mutually moving back into the opposition. Pluto coming forward towards it, Mars moving back into it. It's it'll that double application will be noticeably intense in December.
In December. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have a lot to look forward to. That is a cliffhanger ending then.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. All right. And is there anything else to say about that? I mean, yeah, good luck to everybody. Everybody should vote. I'll put those links to where you can vote. And I think that's actually what's important is people sometimes with astrology get complacent about things, especially if they think they know exactly what's going to happen. But I think it's important in times like this not to become complacent and to actually be part of the change that you wish to see in the world. And this is one of those rare opportunities where a lot of people in the US have an opportunity to make a choice and to directly be involved in that in a very tangible way. And that every person's vote is actually going to matter and potentially change the course of history. So, um, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. And we'll be back again next month to deal with the aftermath and try to piece things together and document what's taken place, as well as once we start getting a feel for how some of these retrogrades are going, then project that out into the future again.
Yeah. And, I mean, it's going to be an interesting time. It'll be an interesting month to be an astrologer and, put on your sort of historical voyeur glasses and be like, so how's this going to play out? Because the astrology is really interesting and tricky and we don't know, but we're going to see, the show's about to begin. So, or this episode, the the season finale, is about to air.
Yeah, and it's like we have our suspicions as well as our preferences and things like that. But I think for the purpose of this, it's more important for people to have some sense of autonomy and to like go out and make it happen. All right, buddy. I think that's it. Thanks for doing this with me. Thanks for joining me
Yeah,
for this yeah, climax of a year that we've already had in terms of lots of crazy astrology, and now we're finally in the end game of it.
yeah, uh, yeah. I don't. Yeah, it's I wish this was the climax. I think things get more and more interesting over the next couple years, which is not just code for bad. Some of it will actually be really interesting. We're at the precipice of a time of climactic change.
Yeah, I'm starting to research already 2025, and 2025 is going to be such a huge turning point year. I'm really looking forward to doing the year ahead forecast, and we've got to start planning for that here. I guess we'll do one more. We'll do the December forecast in 1 month, and then after that, do our year ahead forecast for 2025.
Yeah, the 2025 is the craziest halftime show for the decade. It's the decade's halftime show, and they're pulling out all the stops.
Right. So we've got Saturn, Neptune, and Aries conjunct. We got Uranus going to Gemini, which is crazy. What else is happening?
Um, well, we've got the
Good.
Venus. We've got the whole March April show, right? Which
Right.
it's Neptune ingresses into Aries, but while like with a conjunction from a retrograde Venus and a retrograde Mercury in the middle of eclipses, so the North Node is going to be right on that Neptune. There's going to be eclipses right around it. Like it's not just the Neptune, right? And then it's not just the Saturn. But Uranus, um, to simplify, it is the first year that we're going to see Uranus in Gemini, Neptune in Aries, and Pluto in Aquarius, which we're going to keep until 2032. Um, and that's Uranus, which is the earliest to depart from that configuration. But we're going to keep Neptune in Aries basically almost until 2040. And
Wow.
so, like that, like being introduced to that background, Neptune in Aries and Pluto in Aquarius, is a big deal. And it's also worth noting that all of these ingresses aspect each other. It's going to be Neptune and Aries sextile Pluto and Aquarius. It's going to be Uranus and Gemini, sextile Neptune and Aries, trine Pluto and Aquarius. Like there are three things that are significant in and of themselves, but then they also all aspect. And so does Saturn as it moves into Aries with Neptune and aspects all of this stuff. So it's such a there's a set of profound synergies between all of these factors.
Yeah, for sure. And we haven't seen Neptune go into Aries and Uranus and Gemini since like the mid 1800s, around the time of the Civil War in the United States. So in terms of like consequential events in our history, sort of a return to something close to that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And it's also just on a very simple but I think meaningful sign-based level. We've had Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in nocturnal water and earth signs for many years now. Whereas they're all going into active fire and air signs, right? Like
Mm.
so all of them going into much more active go out and do stuff signs is it's not just that sign shifts are interesting and powerful. They're moving into a more active place, and they're all going to be talking to each other. And Saturn will be with them.
Nice. All right. Yeah. So we'll
Halftime
have a lot
show.
halftime. We'll have a lot to talk about then in our year ahead forecast. So we'll be back again next month to talk about the forecast for December, though. What do you have coming up? What are you working on over the next few weeks?
Still working on faces, making slow but steady progress in the tiny amounts of free time I have to do that. Um, let's see, there's going to be another enrollment for into year one of my program at the end of December. But those go really quick, like an hour or two. So if you want to be part of that, get on the mailing list. I'll let you know exactly when it's going to be ahead of time. Otherwise, one of the series that I elected for Sphere and Sundry, which is a really lovely double benefically blessed Sun and Leo election, came out a few weeks ago. That's available. It's Golden Soul 2, the whatever the opposite of revenge is, the second really nice present that you didn't expect to receive. That just came out. It's really good.
Nice.
Other than that, just trying to find time to work on the book and meet my responsibilities.
And get some what little sleep you can.
Sleep's been getting better. Sleep's been getting better.
Good, good. All right. I'll put a link to your website in the description for this episode. As for myself, I've been working on, people are enjoying the third house episode that I put out this month. And I'm happy to announce I've already recorded the main fourth house episode, as well as a follow-up where I did a live chart reading with patrons about their fourth house placements. So the fourth house episode is amazing. It's reviewing over 50 different examples of people that have the ruler of the ascendant in the fourth house and how the fourth house really informed their life story and their overall life direction. So I'm super excited. That's now available for early access. It's being edited over the next week or two, but if people want to go ahead and get access to a rough cut of it now, you can listen to it immediately through my page on patreon.com/astrology podcast. And yeah, I'm excited to release those episodes this month and also record possibly one or two follow-up episodes because there's a lot of really good material on the fourth house because it's such an important house.
Yeah, literally
Yeah,
fundamental beneath everything.
literally the foundation. So, all right, I guess that's it for this forecast. So, thanks a lot for joining me today, Austin.
My pleasure.
All right, thanks to all the patrons that joined us in the live chat. I appreciate you. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time.
Take care.
If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to support the production of future episodes, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to a bunch of benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, access to the monthly electional astrology podcast, access to another exclusive podcast called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrology podcast. Special thanks to patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozbaz, Kwatsi Alibarahu, and Annie Newman. If you're looking for an astrological consultation, then we have a new list of recommended astrologers on the podcast website. These astrologers offer birth chart readings, synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Go to theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use on the Astrology Podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, and you can get a 15% discount on the software by using the promo code AP15 when you purchase it through alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program Astro Gold for Mac OS, and you can also get a 15% discount when you use the promo code AstroPodcast15 at the website astrogold.io. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then you should get a copy of my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, which is available in both print and now ebook forms, where I've started selling a PDF copy of the book through my website at hellenisticastrology.com/book. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then check out my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology. It's perfect for beginner and intermediate students because I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, including monthly webinars and Q&A sessions. And at the end of the course, if you complete the final test, you'll receive a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. You can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com.